episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and today you have moi and the lovely regular contributor, Emilie Kornheiser, who has been elected a second term, or I guess we say rep-elect.
Well, I'm the rep. I think you're only rep-elect when it's your first time.
Okay.
Because I'm still a representative. I'm still representative until I get re-sworn in. Does that make sense?
It does, but it's not so much fun to say.
I'm sorry.
Anyway, Emilie is the representative for one of the representatives for Brattleboro. So glad to have you here today, Emilie.
So glad to be here, Olga.
And we are basically debriefing from the little thing that people may have noticed happened on Tuesday, which is elections. And while we are still waiting for the federal official results to come in, we are fairly certain, we're pretty certain about Vermont results, with the exception of maybe one or two recounts. But Vermont, we're pretty much good to go on.
Except for the Speaker of the House.
Right. That was the one I was thinking of. That might be a recount. That's going to be interesting. Okay. So, Emilie, congrats on being reelected to your seat. And now that we have had our elections and we are still waiting about the president, but I am curious, as far as Vermont elections go, were there any surprises for you?
Whew, surprises. No, there weren't. I'm sorry. I was really hunting for some and there weren't. There were disappointments, but not a lot of surprises. Mm-hmm. We knew the speaker's race would be close. Mm-hmm. We had a strong feeling that David Zuckerman would not become our next governor. Mm-hmm. Had a feeling that Molly Gray would be elected lieutenant governor in a fairly close race. Mm-hmm. We knew our senators would coast to victory over here in Windham County. Mm-hmm. I was very pleased with my votes in Brattleboro. And I don't think there were any big surprises. There were some races that were close and some races that were, went not necessarily the direction that we wanted to in the closeness, but I don't think there were any big surprises. What is surprising, the most surprising to me, which is not, the surprise isn't in the results, but in the interpretation of the results. And I don't know if you want to jump to that or if that's too early on in our conversation to start talking about talking.
Let's get to that in a second, because I was watching, of course, the results as they came in. And I would have to say I wasn't really surprised, but there were a few moments that I thought, that's interesting. One, I had a feeling Governor Scott would be reelected for a couple of reasons. One, we love to reelect incumbents in Vermont. And two, I think for a lot of people in this time of uncertainty in the pandemic, he has gotten us through, whether you like how he's gotten us through or not. I think for a lot of people, he feels safe right now. Mm-hmm. All fair enough. It did surprise me that David Zuckerman didn't receive more votes. I did expect him to get more votes.
The Windham County bubble is a powerful perceptive shield against the rest of the state, Olga.
True, but he only won Windham County by like one vote, which made me go, huh. And I did expect him to take more like his hometown or more around Chittenden, which tends to go very progressive or blue. And I also found it interesting in the Deerfield Valley. there were a couple of races I was watching in part because there were Republican or other independent candidates going against the incumbents, particularly Laura Sibilia and John Gannon.
Mm-hmm.
And they did nothing in the way of campaigning that I saw. And yet they received quite a few votes for people who had done absolutely nothing for campaigning against the incumbents. And that
That's true of my challenger too, actually.
Yeah, he did not run any kind of campaign that I really saw, or you really saw. And yet he received a fair number of votes, which just makes me wonder, it makes me assume that a lot of people were looking at these names and seeing the R next to them and checking the box. Mm-hmm. And it makes me wonder if there are some shifting tides or something like that happening, especially in the Deerfield Valley.
Mm.
Those caught my attention.
Mm-hmm.
It also caught my attention that Carolyn Partridge, who has served for quite a while up in the Rockingham, Wyndham area, and the newcomer, Leslie Goldman, received more votes than she did, which in general, incumbents tend to do really, really well in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I just marked that as interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So those were some of my responses to the statewide votes.
Yeah. I think we would be remiss in not commenting on how sort of frazzled and raw we both feel today.
Yes.
And that so much is still unknown at the national level, both in terms of what the results of the count will be, but also what the reaction to completing the count will look like, or whether we will be able to complete the count and count every ballot, though it is looking like that's a strong possibility at this point. And I'm really heartened to see that piece of our democracy is intact.
Yeah.
Went to the count every vote vigil last night on the Common.
Yeah.
Thought I would see you there, but Randy was there instead.
Yes.
Had a good chat with him.
Good.
Not the same as seeing you. Sorry, Randy, if you're listening. And it was interesting to see, some folks were there with big sort of F the something signs, or real, righteous, ready in the streets energy. And some people were there in a much sort of fragile, scared energy. I certainly felt more sort of on the raw side and less on the fighting side myself. Lack of sleep does that to me personally. And
I will just tell listeners that Emilie and I both kind of self-medicated Tuesday night with episodes of The Great British Baking Show.
I actually did not watch The Great British Baking Show. I was going to. I think we texted at 1 a.m.
Yep.
And I was about to watch The Great British Baking Show and put myself to bed. And my laptop died, and I decided it wasn't worth going to find a cord. And so I just listened to a podcast and fell asleep.
That works too.
Yeah. But in this time, it was interesting how the remarks that I gave and the remarks that all of the other organizers gave at the, I wasn't one of the organizers, so that all the organizers gave at the event were very much focused on people calming themselves and centering themselves so that they're ready for whatever comes next. And that we can't sort of waste our energy right now freaking out, because we might need that energy later.
That is thank you for sharing that. I think I needed to hear that. I was telling Emilie before we started recording that I tend to be a bit of a Pollyanna optimist, and for better or for worse. But and I'm glad to be wired that way. but there are times where it kicks me right up the backside, because after the last 4 years we've gone through and this pandemic, I just really assumed that when the results started coming in on the national election, that the national map would look different. Mm-hmm. And it compared to 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. And in many ways it does not. Mm-hmm. And I just watched, I was looking at the Guardian's website and just watching the states turn different colors and just sitting there going, but wait a minute, did no one notice the last 4 years?
Well, so I think that's some of the lessons learned or observations about Vermont that I sort of had about the national level and I didn't quite have about Vermont yet, that I'm taking from this election cycle. And part of it is, you say the lessons of the last 4 years, but everyone experienced the last 4 years through a very different media filter.
Yeah.
Good and point. From a very different understanding of who will solve their problems and how those problems should be solved. And so everything goes through that filter as well. And so the person who's the right person to solve those problems is a very different person as well. And I think when I looked at what happened in the statewide elections, I've seen Laura Sibilia commented that, look, you see the maps of the 3 sort of races in Vermont, the 3 statewide races, you see the map of Biden's, like full victory in Vermont, of Governor Scott's full victory, and of Molly's victory. And if you put them, I don't know if you've seen them all 3 next to each other, mm-hmm. and just colored red, blue, but it looks like one's totally red, one's totally blue, and one's like a perfect hybrid of the 2. And you could say, Laura's lesson from that, and I don't want to, speak for Laura, and this is something that she just like sort of said lightly on social media, like, look, we have a purple state. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I don't think that's the lesson. I think the lesson is that people, those are 3 very different candidates who speak very different languages to voters, and have very different theories of how to get things done, and have very different ways of identifying what the problem is. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is really what's resonant for people. I think we're very much beyond the red-blue divide, even though our media still describes it that way, or electoral maps still describe it that way. And I'm like very much not the first person to say this. I don't want in any way anyone to think I think that I like came up with this idea myself. But it's so extra clear to me in Vermont. And it's very clear on the national level. And Masha Gessen, who's pretty brilliant journalist and political commentator, who came here as a refugee from
I don't remember.
Russia. I mean, she came from Russia. I'm trying to figure out a way to describe the Russia that from, a Russia that's led by oligarchs. And so has a lot of lessons to sort of teach us about what it means to live under that kind of regime. Really talks about the deregulation of our media environment. And mm-hmm. that, like the corporate ownership and deregulation of our media environment, is what creates these totally different realities that people are different, but the level to which people believe completely different versions of the last 4 years is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. And the sort of theory of what our problems are and who knows that we have those problems, all of us just want someone to say, like, I see you and I see you in your problems. Mm-hmm. And we're all just getting very different versions of that. And it takes so much time and energy to peel back the curtain, and so many resources to peel back the curtain. And it's often not in a politician's best interest to take the time to do that with someone.
That is a very good point.
Sorry, that's like way deep for. 2 days after.
No. Don't apologize at all. We like, geeky here on this show. I think what I'm sitting with right now is just based on what you just said. I agree with so much of it. And I'm not always a huge fan of how elections are reported on, because sometimes they can be reported on as horse races and more about personalities than ideas, or solutions or plans, or what the candidate says they're going to do. And I also agree with, I've had many concerns about the deregulation of media, in that it has allowed just a few entities to own a lot of the media. But I am going to push back a little bit, because, and I'm going to bring this around to Trump, actually.
Oh, good.
I think one thing that a lot of people like about Trump, at least I'm thinking of the folks in my circle who are pro-Trump, there's a simplicity to him. And kind of, I think, a simplicity that people who like to be dictators tend to have, that I will take care of everything. And you can just kind of relinquish control to them. And I find a lot of folks in my circle kind of like that. He's just going to fix everything.
And I think the flip side of that is that I think a lot of folks feel like he says it like it is.
True. Good point. How I'm going to tie that to media is, and what I want to push back on a little bit is, I hear a lot of, the media. And it's all on the media. And I need to push back against that, because people choose the media that they're going to listen to, or they're going to read, or they're going to watch. And there are media outlets out there that I think do a very poor job. There are some I think do a very good job. But to put it all on the media, I don't think is accurate, because people are choosing the media that they consume. And
I guess I'm not saying that I put it all on the media. I'm putting it on the corporate ownership, not all of it. I'm putting some of it. And actually, I heard Masha Gessen say this as a reporter in a talk recently, and I was like sort of pushing back in my head, like, no, these are about people making decisions, like just what you're saying. And it's the incentives that corporate ownership of media puts in place for how conversations are driven, and what conversations get focused on, and what sort of the drive for ratings versus quality that has to naturally happen in our larger media environments, and how slow the change in that is. So, there's lots of parts of the country where, every restaurant, every grocery store, every wherever has a TV up and playing all the time with Fox News. And there's other parts of the country where that's C-SPAN. And then there's Vermont, where there's very few places where there are any TVs playing at all. And so if you're in an environment where you culturally, the majority listens to that particular media strain, you might not even realize that you're making a choice towards that. It's just sort of, that's the station you listen to, which I guess it might be NPR here for lots of Vermonters, but.
Well, yeah, I hear that argument, and I see what you're saying. And thank you for clarifying that. I think that's why in many cases, places like PBS were even first created, is to have, and why things like Brattleboro Community Television as a public access station exists.
And the Brattleboro Public Access Station we're fighting for right now, right? Because media was further deregulated, and the cable fees that paid for Brattleboro Community TV to exist aren't providing the same level of income that they used to. And so they need to find a whole new funding stream for themselves.
Right.
Yeah. So when I think about the different candidates that won and their ability to be frank with voters, I think that covers some of it. I think also the level of the Prague-Dem divide in the rest of the state, and even in Windham County, is much realer than we often give it credit for. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a lot of Democratic voters who feel just as loyal to the Progressive Party as they do to the Republican Party. And that really surprises me as someone who's very much embraces both of my political identities. But I think for a lot of voters, they really saw Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman as a progressive candidate, not as a Democratic candidate, even though that was sort of the ticket that he won the primary on.
Interesting.
And so I talked to people who really sort of made that decision. They didn't feel like he was theirs to fight for, theirs to vote for.
Mm-hmm. And as far as Windham County goes, Zuckerman did not do a whole lot of campaigning down here. So I don't know how well voters ever got to meet him or hear his ideas. So how much do you think that played in, at least as far as Windham County goes, into some of people's choices? In other words, so all they could see was Prague or Dem.
Say that one more time.
Because he didn't do a lot of campaigning down here, the only real thing they had to go on was that, he was the lieutenant governor and he's running on, he's either a progressive or a Dem.
Yeah. And view. I think that, because he was sort of a progressive first, that made it easier to not have the party loyalty that people might have had when voting for Biden or voting for, there was a lot of emphasis on sort of voting the straight ticket. But because the P came first, I think that helped. Also, I don't want to in any way discount the profound power of incumbency that Scott had in this election. He was on the radio every single day saying reassuring things to people.
Yeah.
That's
huge.
That's huge. It's huge. And he's incredibly skilled with his veto pen at always sort of walking the middle line, that when he vetoes something that's like really hard for people, he always signs something at the same time that will ease the angst. And, I think he does that from a place of political strategy. It doesn't seem, I don't see a lot of political philosophy cohesion in which is vetoed and which is not. Mm-hmm. So that's very real.
Yeah. I think,
So I don't want to draw meaning where there isn't. And similarly, the speaker's race, I think, is a similar place that a lot of meaning is being drawn that shouldn't be drawn from it.
We have a few minutes before we have to go to break. Anything you want to tie up for listeners? Because I feel like we did kind of around in circles a little bit.
I think nationally, I don't want to discount the power of race and racism and anxiety and how disappointing that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I am still sitting with a lot of this week, so I apologize for not sounding more profound.
That's why I started this whole thing off by saying we should talk about how we are. Yeah, one cannot write history while it's happening, even though I guess that's your job, isn't it?
Yeah, but my job is only the first draft of history, and then I have to write a follow-up. Well, and I am also sitting with how you talked a little bit about the Vermont bubble. I am also really sitting with, especially as a journalist, how different it was for me to write about these elections, because while Vermont is far from perfect, I have confidence in our town clerks, and I have confidence in our Secretary of State, Jim Kondos. And I have confidence that there's no skullduggery happening. Yes. And that, I think, made this election very different for me than it did for many of my friends in other parts of the country.
I think that is so important to talk about. And thank you for bringing it up. I don't think there was enough conversation after the last election, the extent to which voter disenfranchisement, both on the individual level and then on the systemic level, led to the results that we got. And then in this round of the election, how polling does not take into account the kind of individual casual voter disenfranchisement that happens with long lines or trouble accessing absentee ballots or that kind of thing. That's different and not better or worse than the terribleness of people being taken off of voter rolls and not being able to, vote even if they fight for it. But polling doesn't take that into account.
Right.
And so we are, here in Vermont, it's so hard to project ourselves into the reality of so much of the rest of the country since the Voting Rights Act has been gutted that our town clerks do an incredible job. We have some of the earliest voting available in the country, and we had ballots mailed to everyone, and we had easy places to drop them off. And the only line we had in Brattleboro was like 5 minutes at the very beginning of the day because people were waiting outside the polls. And our machines aren't connected to the internet. And I mean, there's so much there that's so available. People who are incarcerated in Vermont can vote while they're incarcerated.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's even just, and we're just about to have to go to break, but I'll make this one point. I think it drove home for me when I was talking to friends. Oops, I forgot to put that on silent. Ignore that. Talking to friends just over the line in Keene, New Hampshire, who I said, "Oh, so did you mail in your ballots yet?" Duh, assuming they were voting absentee. And they said, "Oh, no. In New Hampshire this year, you could check COVID as a reason not to go or why you need an absentee ballot. But in general, they were telling me, in New Hampshire, you have to have a reason to vote absentee.
A really strong reason. Working is not a good enough reason. I've had friends who couldn't, the last election cycle, who, it's wild. And
that is such a small thing, but for folks who might have any kind of barrier, it's huge.
Yeah, no, it's
really huge. Anyway, sorry.
We're going to break. Sorry, no, we're going to break.
Okay, we are going to break because the beep beep went off. We at the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 shall return in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters, and we are talking elections and what's next for Vermont here with Representative Emilie Kornheiser. Welcome back, Emilie.
Thanks, Olga. You know what I know about our show?
What do you know?
I know that the views and opinions expressed on this show are the opinions and views of the host, Olga, the guest, myself, and nobody else, not the station. That's something I know about our show.
That is a good thing to know. It's good for our listeners to know that too.
I thought they might like to hear that.
I appreciate it, Emilie. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so Vermont and the elections and the landscape. In some ways, I'm feeling a lot hasn't changed, but it probably has.
Yeah. So the Dems lost a couple House seats, all in very close races. And one of those House races was our Speaker of the House, Mitzi Johnson. And I think she filed for a recount today.
Okay. Yeah, because it was 11 votes, 18 votes, something like that.
I should definitely know the exact number, and I don't remember. It was less than 30.
Yeah.
And the House Minority Leader, the leader of the Progressive Caucus, also lost his seat by a very close margin.
Oh, wow. I hadn't seen that.
Robin Chestnut Tangerman. And so I think a lot of people are drawing broad conclusions for what this means about a mandate from the voters and what this means for the party or the parties and sort of left vision across the state. And I don't think that's fair or appropriate.
No.
Both of those folks have been operating in really districts that tend to be sort of right on the edge every time. I think Mitzi's always had very, very close races.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating that we voted in a speaker 2 times who was in such tight races and had to be so careful about her reelection.
Mm-hmm.
And so, she's requested a recount. It is very close. We will see what happens. But that certainly puts a lot of things up in the air in the Vermont House.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the Progressive Party, the loss of Robin is really counterbalanced by a surge of some really strong young female progressive candidates, new progressive candidates.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. And it's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Talking about voter mandates, I always find that interesting when we try to ascribe something very specific to something that happens very quiet, very personally. People go in, they mark their ballots, but we don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
We can assume.
No, we don't know why.
But we don't know why.
We don't have exit polling here.
Right. I was just going to say that is a place where some kind of polling could actually be more useful afterwards at exit polling to just say, okay, why did you make the choices you did? Mm-hmm. That would actually be kind of useful. But as someone who is in the legislature, when you see these results, I'm gonna change that question. Sorry.
There's no need to apologize.
You're so good. You're breaking me of that habit.
Mm.
How do you decide or choose or find out what your constituents want? Because one thing about democracy is it's run by those who show up, but sometimes those who show up are squeaky wheels.
So squeaky, those wheels.
And not necessarily the majority of opinion. Mm-hmm. So, how is that for you? Like, what do you do?
So I'll answer what I do personally, and then there's some sort of theories around that. So there's what I did personally, my first time around, was I went and knocked on every single door, and I had conversations at every single one of those doors that were home.
Yeah.
And left stuff for folks who
weren't talking to doors.
No. And my campaign materials are very detailed, and my website is very detailed about my policy proposals. And the sort of card I left is more detailed than is recommended. The type is, the font is too small for political stuff. And then I took all of those conversations I had and I brought them with me to Montpelier when I think about it. And then I also, I host constituent conversations every week. That's very much a place where, squeaky wheels tend to come rather than, obviously the whole town doesn't come to that. And then I tried to read the less virulent Facebook posts to just sort of see, like, what are people asking questions about? Like, what is something that people keep on asking for help with on Facebook that there's like actually a service to help them with that, but they don't seem to know it exists, right? So I try to notice stuff like that. And then this round of elections, that was really hard. And so I called a whole lot of people, but it's really very much not the same as knocking on people's doors.
Yeah.
Partly because, I had someone answer the phone recently who, after I sort of said something and then paused, she said, "Oh, wait, are you a real person?" And I was like, "Yes, I am. I'm a real person." Like and it's hard because if you call enough, most people aren't home. You leave enough messages that your voice sort of starts to become my voice becomes a little rehearsed. And so a lot of people just, I had 2 people hang up on me without saying anything. And I was like, I almost called them back and was like, I am a real person. You could say no, thank you. Which there's nothing to be gained. So I did not do that, but I was just like, maybe they just didn't know it was me. Maybe they thought I was recording. I get recordings on my phone. So those are things that I do. And then I talk to sort of community agencies a lot and try to talk, hear what their constituencies want. I think that's really important. There are, unions and associations that speak for their full memberships. And that's important, but it feels less meaningful to me than talking to sort of community level businesses about, with their workers or with agencies about their constituencies, because sort of the statewide needs of a constituency would be very, very different from the county level or the town level needs of that constituency. Right. So that's what I do. But I think what's important to note about that is that there's different ways of doing that. So there's something that in like organizing land is called deep canvassing or relational organizing. And that's what I like to do. Like, I'm happy to spend 45 minutes sitting and talking to someone because I'm not there to sell something. I'm there to listen and to get to know and have someone get to know me rather than, and I tend to not even end my conversation with, can I have your vote? Because that's for someone to sort of think on. And so that's really different from, I think, from persuasion canvassing, which is absolutely has its place, but it's about moving a specific idea forward, or it's about getting someone elected rather than as an opportunity to really hear from constituents. And one of the things that's really nice about living in a district like Brattleboro that tends to be much more reliable Democratic vote is I can do that without a real risk to my seat. I can sort of try it I can really do it the other way and trust that that system's going to work. And then I can take the time to do that and really listen to people. Because I believe long-term, it's better for the health of our community's democracy.
Yes. Yes. The reason I asked that question, I know we're talking about the elections that just happened, but it feels right now more than ever that we have, as a community, some real conversations and get very clear about what needs we have so we can start finding some definite solutions. And for some reason right now, looking at these elections where I'm sitting with them, that's what feels really important. And it might be because, again, my optimism catches me off guard sometimes. It really surprises me how things often are concepts or needs. I was thinking about what you said about the print and the detail of your Leave Behind campaign information. There's almost a sense that we have to dumb things down for voters. And while there are low information voters and there are people who don't care, or there are people who are just so busy they can't care, that doesn't mean they're stupid.
No.
And it seems sometimes like there's a disconnect there.
And that's what I was trying to get at when I was talking before about people really want people who are going to solve real problems and speak frankly about those problems.
Yeah.
And I think that is, I don't know if that's about assuming capability and capacity on the part of citizens.
Okay.
And I think that's really important. And I think when we I think one of the dangers of serving too long is that political language starts to become real to you. As in, any industry that you're in long enough, the language that people speak, you start to think that that's how other people speak. Right. It's just inside talk.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that we, sort of with the speakers race, that people, I assume maybe people are interested in how that all works, because it's sort of bizarre palace intrigue, fascinating, if that's worth explaining, how we wind up with a Speaker of the House.
No, I think that, yes, I do think that's worth explaining.
Okay. Should we talk about it now, or should we talk about that in a little bit?
Let's talk about it now, because I want to make sure we get to what's next.
Okay. So the Speaker is going to ask for a recount, and if it turns out that she did win, and some mistakes were made or some ballots were miscounted, which would be a mistake, then she would likely remain Speaker, though that's not guaranteed. But otherwise, we elect a new one. And so that process usually starts within the majority caucus, which in this case, space is the Democratic caucus, and we would sort of nominate who we would want the Speaker to be. We would make that choice, and then that person would be put forward to the whole body for a vote. And so that, because the Speaker of the House is not just the sort of the leader of their caucus, that's the majority leader. They are in fact the leader of the entire body. And so Senator Ballant is likely going to be the new pro tem of the Senate, which is essentially like the Speaker of the House, but they call it the President pro tem. And that person is the leader of the entire body, not just their caucus. Though it's, if you're in the majority, then the majority is who chooses. That's the democracy again. And that person really has the power to decide in a lot of ways, what will pass or not, because they get to decide what comes to the floor and what doesn't. So they decide where bills go, which committees those bills go to, which would give a different experience for each bill. They decide the schedule for the floor. And they also decide the makeup of the committees.
That is the part where I think they have the most power, just personally. Yes.
And so in the House, just the Speaker gets to decide that. They do it in consultation with other people, but technically it's entirely their power. And it's not just the composition of the committees influences what decisions get made in those committees, but the power to take someone on and off a committee provides a tremendous amount of leverage for people getting along or not getting along with the wishes of the Speaker. In the Senate, that is done by the Committee on Committees, which is made up of the Lieutenant Governor, who will be Molly Gray, the pro tem, who will likely be Senator Ballant, and then someone called the third member. Oh,
that is a great name.
Yes.
I don't know. That needs to be a title of a book.
It's pretty amazing. Who is also elected by the body, similar to how the pro tem or the Speaker would be elected. And again, that really happens sort of through palace intrigue by the caucus, and then is brought to the whole body.
Right. Are you reading a text message?
I am. I'm so sorry.
Busted.
Thank you for busting me. I'm like, it's the same way. I told you about, this is like meditating. I cannot.
We are so fractured right now.
I know. I have this theory that by tomorrow, my system will be recalibrated and I'll be ready for what's next. But it's like a theory I came up with 2 weeks ago. It was like the Friday after the election. That's when things will make sense.
You know what? I think you need to give yourself until Sunday night. Just have a real blowout, and then Sunday night be like, okay, time to pull up the big person's pants.
Yeah.
At least that's what I'm going to tell myself.
Okay. Cool.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Bring me back. Where are we, Olga?
Okay. Well, I think this is a great segue. Talking about the Speaker of the House talks a little bit about power and how things can or cannot move through the legislative process. But it brings me back, and our discombobulation right now also brings me back to what you said at the top of the show about conserving energy. Mm-hmm. Because we may have all sorts of feels right now, but the fact is that whoever becomes president, mm-hmm. and whatever happens in Vermont in the next biennium, the work isn't done. And there were problems before COVID. There were problems before the 2016 election that have not gone away. So for Vermont, what is next? I mean, how do we move forward? And where can people put their energy so it's the most useful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I look down now, I'm doodling.
Doodling's okay. That helps your brain.
Yeah. So there's the importance of the presidential election on, basic civil and human rights, right? Mm-hmm. Not having babies in cages, making sure that women can access reproductive care, that kind of thing, the future of the courts, labor laws, there's all of that. And that's very, 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 very important. And what we're going to need across the country as sort of the next step in COVID, in addition to the kind of sort of medical and policy interventions that need to happen in states other than Vermont, who are seeing increasing cases, is mm-hmm. also we just need significant federal financial resources.
Yeah.
Very badly. We needed another COVID relief package very, very badly, months and months and months ago.
And one that can be actually used in proactive ways.
Yes, one that can be used to bring benefits directly to people and directly into long-term planning. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really important part, a geekier, longer term part of why I, as a legislator, desperately want Biden to be elected. Mm-hmm. And want to see a Democratic majority, who I know will need significant pushback the same way our legislature in Vermont with a Democratic majority still needed significant pressure to ensure that that money was going to Vermonters.
Right.
And to pause enough to do long-term planning, because we're all in panic state, hard to do long-term planning from panic state.
Imagine that.
I know. Biology, it's the worst. But that is the next step. It's really figuring, there's making sure that we count every vote, making mm-hmm. sure that once those votes are counted, that the election results are respected, right? And that is, there's, for folks who don't know this already, there's a website, Count Every Vote, and it has local chapters. And it's really helpful for quick mobilization. I get daily emails from them now. And a lot of our sort of social justice organizations around the state are connected into that mm-hmm. and are doing the local organizing on it. So the vigil on the Commons yesterday was organized by 350 Vermont, Rights and Democracy, The Root, mm-hmm. and Out in the Open. And in other parts of the state, it was sort of much more organized by statewide organizations. But that's a great place to go to know about what will need to happen if we need to mobilize on that stuff. Mm-hmm. But either way, whoever wins, we're going to need to push really hard against this narrative that there aren't enough resources to meet people's needs.
Yeah.
And so that's going to happen in Vermont, no matter what our COVID relief package looks like. It's going to be a really complicated tax year. Mm-hmm. And so I want to make sure we're out in front of that, that we're really identifying where the cracks are and where the opportunities are. So today I spent the morning in a government accountability joint committee meeting. Mm-hmm. Are you writing, Olga? I am. Now I want to catch you on your phone. But you're not.
My phone is over there set on Do Not Disturb, so I can't see it.
Smart lady. I turned mine upside down. So I was in the
I already left my alarm on, so it goes beep, beep, beep. So, okay. You got me already.
Okay, good. So I was in the Joint Government Accountability Committee meeting this morning. It was the first time. Usually we're a committee that meets during the off session. That's what most of the joint committees do. And since the off session is only 2 months long this time, we have a lot of work to do in a very short amount of time. So that's problematic.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And that's true for the Child Protection Oversight Committee that I had like high hopes for what they were supposed to do this summer. It's true.
Makes me feel sick. Yes.
But one thing that I brought up was we need to really identify what are the indicators of our community health that will help make decisions about post-COVID or mid-COVID. To really be clear on like what are the cracks in the system that have been illuminated and how are we telling that story to other legislators. And so that's a project I'm going to be working on for the next month or two. Because we need to get clear on what our needs are before we can figure out what comes next. But we know that we need revenues for whatever it is.
Yeah.
And really need for Vermonters or, Vermont families. I've been trying to use the term Vermont families because I think Vermonter sometimes has a little bit of a nativist tinge to it. So I know that Vermont, because you need to have so much permission to become a Vermonter, right? And so I don't know if people always feel included in that term when I say it.
Oh, okay.
So I know that Vermont families really need to be clear that they're interested in having those cracks be closed. They want their unemployment system to work. The ballot referendum in Florida to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour while the state went to Trump. Right? Like, that's fascinating.
That is very fascinating.
And so really encourage voters to be really clear with your legislators about like, where are your priorities? Just like make sure like someone will like people respond to emails, like it's real people reading real emails. Like we don't have staff. So just like tell me, tell your legislator, tell the governor, tell the whoever, but like just take 4 seconds and say, these are my priorities.
Yeah.
These are my problems that I want you to solve.
Yeah. Yeah. That alone would be extremely powerful. Yeah. I appreciate your responses, Emilie, because one thing I'm sitting with, and the reason I had a little panic attack when you said the off session is 2 months.
Yeah. That was a really, yeah. I mean, most of the joint committees don't do anything very important. So I'm very curious about why you had the panic attack.
Well, I had a panic attack because I try, you know me, I have an overwhelming sense of responsibility for everything. And so I've been trying to sit with where my reporting needs to focus. And that feels like such a precious resource for me, especially at the Commons, because we are essentially a full-time staff of 3. And we have some amazing freelancers who help out, but my time and what I can cover feels really limited a lot of the time. And so I always try to think of like, okay, if I need to focus my energy, where is it going to be? What's going to serve the community the most? And so I've been thinking about that lately. And so that is in part when I ask that next step question, part of what I'm asking is, okay, so what do I need to tell the community? So it can make the choices it needs to do, express the priorities it needs to express, whatever. And that the election has really brought that home for me about, how do I facilitate the community in doing what it needs so it can get its needs met. And for some reason, that responsibility feels huge right now.
Yeah. Did we talk right after Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death?
I don't think we did.
So one thing that I really took from her passing, and she's, I think I'll probably look a lot like her when I'm old. And
that would,
which would be a gift, but we just have a lot of sort of ethnic similarities. And her story in terms of how she was educated and the opportunities that were available to her are very sort of similar to my grandmother's stories. And so I feel a lot of perhaps an excess of resonance towards her, as I'm sure many people do. And that's how heroes work. And so one thing that I really was stuck with is I come from a long line of women who believe that, you know, all the responsibilities of the world rest on our shoulders. And that can be that, like, if the egg cartons don't get brought back to the farm and they're in a pile, like, the world's going to collapse. Like, there's a lot of sort of catastrophizing that comes with feeling like the entire world sits on your shoulders.
This is feeling very familiar. Yes.
And, but there's also, like, the real talk part of the entire world sits on your shoulders. Like, you are a Supreme Court judge and, like, you're passing really important decisions, or you are a really important part of the local community media. And, like, you are responsible for citizens knowing things, or you're a state legislator and there's, you know, a big revenue shortfall, whatever it is. But I was so sad for her when she passed, that she felt that the world was sitting so heavily on her narrow little shoulders that she had to fight death to that extent. That she couldn't even let herself pass peacefully, right? Because she was sort of worried to her last, because she was worried for so long.
Yeah.
And that she lost track of the fact that she's part of a much broader swath of history. And that we're also, that the roads that the paths that she widened or opened for us, we all have a responsibility to walk down. That the norms that she upheld, we all have a responsibility to uphold. And that none of it doesn't sit on any of our narrow or wider shoulders. I have quite wide shoulders. I don't really have very narrow shoulders, but it doesn't sit on any of our one shoulders. It is a community effort and a community responsibility. And I think we need to remember that if we are going to be able to live our life with the grace that we deserve, and that our, you know, that our loved ones deserve.
Yeah. Thank you, Emilie. That was really lovely and poignant. And it reminds me.
It's the first time I said that without sobbing. So that's also, like, a huge plus. Thanks.
I was watching. I'm feeling. You know, and I think that's pertinent right now, too, because we all know we're in a slightly divided society right now. And when we talk community, we really need to mean it. And we need to live it. And so maybe that should be our community resolution for 2021.
Yeah.
Is to serve each other. We are out of time. Here on the Happy Hour on WVW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. But before we go, Emilie, do you have a toast?
Yeah, toast to voting.
Toast to voting.
May every vote be counted.
Hear, hear. Thank you, everybody. We will be back next week.